is that story for a gospel reading? Who here is really disturbed by this story? Who here has ever seen Game of Thrones? It's like, oh yeah, that's actually how so much of history has been when it comes to leadership. What are we to make of this story? I was talking with Gwen last night, trying to wrestle. I've been helping her with learning her classical Greek, so she's helping me kind of process verbally my sermons. It's a good synergetic relationship. And we were trying to land on one thing that could be a really good interpretation on this. And the original intention that I had was to point to, however accountability for vows that you make comes, are we going to listen to it? John the Baptist might not have been the most gentle of accountability holders, but he was holding Herod Antipas to Torah, which is the law of the land of Israel. Leviticus 18:16 says, "You shall not have your brother's wife. You shall uncover her nakedness because it is your brother's nakedness." It's a really weird terminology, and you're like, what does that mean? I won't go into details, but basically it's saying, you don't get to marry your brother's wife. But what about levirate marriage in Deuteronomy? Which says if your brother dies, you are to marry his wife to take care of her. Well, the problem is, that's assuming he dies. But Philip was still alive. Philip was Antipas' brother. And Philip was married to Herodias, and they divorced. And Antipas divorced his own wife and got together with Herodias, and it seemed to work out okay, except for that pesky, Torah thing. It's a lot of stuff that doesn't fit into our context. I would argue that, hey, maybe it doesn't matter so much if Philip didn't want to stay with Herodias. Herodias fell in love with Antipas, and Antipas fell in love with Herodias, and so everybody divorced their partners and got together with the ones they wanted. Sounds like a TV show nowadays. Even more so, the Torah says if a man wants to divorce his wife, he just needs to give her a certificate of divorce. It wasn't until Jesus' time where divorce was frowned upon. So there's all kinds of swirling stuff going on here. But then I stepped back and thought, you know what? That's just it. There's no clean-cut way of looking at the story if you're going to get the full picture. So I'm going to take off my traditional preacher hat of let's find that one theme and drill it home. I'm going to put on my CMM cap for a minute, which is the communication theory that I'm teaching a class on if you're interested in joining us midday on Sundays, and look at what are all the stories at play here. So with the characters, you got Jesus, who they're trying to figure out if he's Elijah, is he John the Baptist raised from the dead, is he another prophet in the line of Moses? That's people trying to figure out what Jesus' role is. You've got Herod, who is the king. Herod is actually a title for kings. Herod Antipas. King Antipas is saying, now it must be John the Baptist who I killed. And feeling maybe a little bit guilty about having John the Baptist beheaded. Why? Because he respected John even though John was telling him, what you're doing is absolutely wrong. Okay? Once again, in ancient patriarchal societies, the woman's story doesn't really get a lot of perspective or airtime. Why do you think Herodias might have been a little bit upset for John the Baptist condemning her marriage to the man she allegedly loved? Well, if Herod does divorce her or kicks her out, where does she end up? In a really bad spot. Because women had power in the ancient Roman world, but it was never independent of their fathers or husbands. So I would be a little bit angry too if I had finally gotten to marry for love and suddenly this self-righteous know-it-all over here is telling me that my marriage isn't valid. Now, I like the fact that Mark, in true Mark fashion, for the sake of brevity, doesn't actually get the name of Herodias' daughter right. It's actually Salome. Once again, each scripture, each gospel has its own unique perspective and little nuances. And then you've got Herodias' daughter, Salome. Was she also anti-John the Baptist? Or was she just trying to please her mother and her stepfather, trying to do the best she could to survive in an impossible situation? I imagine the dancing that she was doing was probably not something you would expect at a 6-year-old recital.
Yeah.
I'm guessing probably in an icky way, maybe the reason Herod offered her up to half his kingdom is because the way she danced pleased him in a way that may not have been the most wholesome family dynamic. Marriage is weird back then. Philip was Herodias, when she married Philip, she was engaged when she was 8, he was 20, and she was his half-niece. So it was kind of incestuous. So there's a lot of weird stuff going on here. Now, what does this have to do with the price of bread or with our lives? How do we take a really gruesome story and try to find out why things happen this way? Herodias probably felt like her only recourse was to silence John the Baptist at all costs. Is that the wrong thing? Absolutely. Is that the way things were done when you are higher up in power in the ancient medieval world? Also, absolutely. Herod, it kind of reminds me of Adam in the story of the fall, where Eve says, when God asked her what's going on, she's like, well, the serpent made me do it, and goes to Adam, and he's like, she told me to take a bite. I'm like, way to go, man. Way to blame the woman for your own choice, or blaming anyone else for your own choice. Take accountability. Herod Antipas, I wonder, might have been a better man had he not had to be in his position as king, which, keep in mind, the Herods weren't technically fully Jewish. They were Idumean, which is kind of an outsider group. So the added insult to injury of having a Rome-appointed king was that Jews in Jerusalem had to answer to the king of the Jews, who wasn't really a Jew. It's kind of like having a foreign president. Regardless of whether or not they do a good job, it's still not the president from this nation. And if he's doing a terrible job, it's even worse. So, and then let's look at John the Baptist for a minute. Now, who here has read any of the major or minor prophets in the Old Testament? Anybody in EFM? Yeah. Were they nice guys? No. What was Elijah like, especially in the whole contest with the prophets of Baal? Exactly. Go ahead. Tell us.
Oh, yeah, I brought fire down, so I'm going to just kill all X hundred of those prophets. Mm-hmm. Yay, I win.
Yep. He proved God's supremacy over the god Baal, and not only did that, but he decided, you know what, I'm going to call down God's fire and kill everybody that was supporting Baal. Or Elisha, his protege, when the boys were mocking him on the street, because you know how teenage boys can be less than ideal when it comes to respecting other people, what did he do to admonish them? He called down a bear from the mountains to eat them. Not my idea of the best way for kids to learn respect, especially if they're dead. And as funny as that is, the gravitas of what that means is something that we would find absolutely unacceptable. But these are the figures that held the kings accountable to what Torah required of them. Keep in mind, Torah is the covenant of the land. They, whether they like it or not, are committed to this covenant. So John the Baptist, while not doing a very nice way of doing things, was still holding the king of Jerusalem to the law of the land, or at least as he understood it. And what happened to him? He lived happily ever after. Nope, exactly. Off with his head. Is anybody truly the bad guy in the story? Or bad woman? Is anybody truly the good guy or good woman in the story? The closest I could think of is John the Baptist. Exactly. It's easy to think that we understand how things should be. It's easy for us to condemn those in power for behaving in a corrupt and despicable way. And a lot of times, we're right. And those who are in power should be held accountable to the law of the land. They should uphold the community that they serve. And if all you do is browbeat people into the ground, it oftentimes backfires on you and ends up getting you in serious trouble. Also, if you're in leadership and you break the rules, you need to be held accountable for breaking those rules. If we have a society that has systems, laws, and customs that are built to keep people from having power and independence as individuals based on gender, based on orientation, based on class, based on race, that also needs to be called into question. So what's the common denominator here? Love. What would have happened if there could have been a kind of conversation where Herodias and Herod could have found love and not had to deal with arranged marriages that they didn't want? What if John the Baptist... Oh, Madeline, you had your hand up? Nope, okay. What if John the Baptist could have either gently brought this up or found a way to engage with Torah in such a way as to uphold what Torah calls for, but finding the spirit, not the letter of the law? Why was that law in place in the first place? What if Salome, Herodias' daughter, had acted on her own behalf when Herod offered her a gift? And why did she not challenge her mother for murder? What was she afraid of? Is anybody squirming right now? Good. Do we recognize that there is no way in life that the fantasy of a perfectly good person, perfectly bad person exists, and we've just got to be like the good person and we'll defeat evil and all is good? We're in a time and place in human history that is uniquely poised for what we call a paradigm shift. It means the way we see the world has a chance to be enhanced, to be evolved, to bring more opportunity for everyone to be at the table, everyone to work together to figure out how to be in covenantal relationship with God and each other. I'd rather we didn't have beheadings of people because those in leadership didn't approve of it. I'd rather that we didn't have leaders that kill people just to keep their power. I'd rather that religion existed to love and care for and serve people than to browbeat them into submission and fear. I'd like a world where people who disagree with one another can continue to be good friends, love one another, and care for each other. I want a world where Christ's love reigns supreme, which means we give generosity to one another. Or even if you behead John the Baptist, even if you crucify Jesus, their story cannot be kept down because of the love that they show. The trick, though, is we have to allow for the uncomfortable, ambiguous, squirmy reality of human existence. That none of us is without sin, and none of us is without goodness. But to try to care for one another, to try to understand one another, rather than condemn, lord over, or kill off those who disagree with us or those who threaten us. Where we slow down enough to try to understand that person that we cannot understand how they can believe what they believe. We may never change them. We may never change our viewpoints. But to have that compassion. So this really gruesome, really weird story gives us an opportunity to explore that difficult, squishy, you can't quantify it reality of our lives together and what love calls us to. And back to my original point, may we always, no matter what, be willing to hold ourselves first accountable to our own commitments and help other people find their way to their own accountability, to where accountability is no longer the issue that it was because we are just striving for the highest life. So as we step into this summer, and as we step into this new life that we're in, may we remember that. May we slow down and stop and think about these things so that we can continue to build deeper and better relationships and a safer world for everyone. Amen.